LinkedIn presents.
I'm Rufus Griscom, and this is The Next Big Idea. Today, we live in an age of magical overthinking. What can we do about it? One name has come up over and over again on this show.
So Danny Kahneman, who's probably a familiar name to many listeners.
Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel Prize-winning psychologist.
This concept ended up in the book because of a conversation that I had with Daniel Kahneman.
Daniel Kahneman died last month. He was 90. He leaves behind a groundbreaking body of work that has influenced literally dozens of the big thinkers we've had on this show. And Kahneman will surely continue to influence economists, psychologists, baseball GMs, and even linguists. You're going to hear from one of them today. Kahneman is best known for the work he did in the 1970s alongside Amos Tversky. Together, they detonated one of the bedrock assumptions of classical economics, the belief that human beings are rational. Instead, Kahneman and Tversky showed our emotions and unconscious predilections constantly cause us to act in wildly irrational ways. They called these derailing quirks and mental hiccups cognitive biases. You may have heard of some of them: confirmation bias, the sunk cost fallacy. These and other cognitive biases are as relevant today as they were 50 years ago. In fact, they may be even more relevant in our era of information overload. They're certainly more pernicious. That's the argument put forth in a new book by linguist Amanda Montell called The Age of Magical Overthinking: Notes on Modern Irrationality. Amanda recently spoke with my colleague and the Next Big Idea Club's editorial director, Panio Giannopoulos, who is here with me now. Hi, Panio.
Hi, Rufus.
So, Panio, you read more books, I think, than anyone at the Next Big Idea Club. I mean, I read like a book a week. You must read twice that many. I picture your desk as just strewn with heaps and heaps of books. Why did, among all these books, The Age of Magical Overthinking jump out at you and cause you to want to pick up the phone and have a conversation with Amanda?
It's actually a bedside stack of books, and it is about 4 feet tall and precarious. And my wife is always asking me to whittle it down. Though, in fact, in this instance, she stole my copy of The Age of Magical Overthinking, and I had to wrestle it back from her and explain that I need it because I'm going to do a podcast interview with Amanda.
This happens in my household, Panio, all the time. My almost perfect wife swipes the book that I'm reading in preparation just days before a podcast interview, which is not okay. I mean, it may be a good indication for our listeners, but it's a problem for the podcast host.
Yeah, it's one of those marital arguments that you really never see coming.
Yeah.
But to answer your original question, the book is really timely. Right? There have been plenty of books about biases in the past, many of them very good, but we're in this moment where, we're having so much trouble understanding each other. We're having so much anxiety and overthinking brought about by this immersion and constant screen times and being online all the time. And Amanda does a really remarkable job about explaining what this comprehension gap is about, explaining where the anxiety is coming from. It's heavily researched and yet somehow also a breezy, fun read.
I don't want to spoil too much for listeners, but I'm curious, Panio, did Amanda's book make you feel more or less hopeful that we can find a way out of this quagmire of irrationality we've found ourselves in?
I'm still deciding, though I will say at the very least, I'm more forgiving of other people's irrational beliefs and my own, and maybe that's the start of a way out.
All right, let's take a short break, and when we come back, we'll hear your conversation with Amanda Montell.
The LinkedIn Podcast Network is sponsored by TIAA. TIAA makes you a retirement promise, a promise of a guaranteed retirement paycheck for life. Learn more at TIAA.org/promises pay off.
Amanda Montell, welcome to The Next Big Idea.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm very excited to talk with you. I devoured your book, The Age of Magical Overthinking, which I'm holding up. You have a giant poster of it right behind you, so I guess I don't need to hold this up.
I feel the need to make the disclaimer that I did not make this. My publisher did. They sent it to my house. I'm not this person, but I guess I am. Whatever. Yes, a big poster of my book is behind me. Forgive me.
All right, let's start with your book, which I love, The Age of Magical Overthinking. Just get right to it. What's magical thinking? We should probably talk about that first. Or magical overthinking.
What's magical? Yeah, no, but it's important. I'm glad you asked the question the way you did because it's important to define the first before we can define the second. Magical thinking, as many listeners probably know, is this tendency to believe that our internal thoughts and feelings can affect external events. And this is an age-old cognitive quirk, especially during times of unpredictability or pain. We feel the need to reclaim agency in whatever way we can. So we begin to make up stories about our minds having an effect on events that are happening to us. It's a sort of misattribution of cause and effect to help the world feel more manageable. But I argue in this book that the psychological shortcuts that we've always taken to make sense of the world enough to survive it have combined poorly with the information age. So these deep-rooted mental magic tricks that we play on ourselves called cognitive biases that once had a net positive effect on our experience of life are clashing with the technologically focused world that we've created. And that is a phenomenon that I'm calling magical overthinking.
So magical thinking, can you give me an example of magical thinking? I think of children, right? Where they think, oh, if I do this, step on a crack, break your mother's back, right? So this kind of
exactly
these totally unconnected events will somehow cause each other.
Yeah, I tell a very brief anecdote in the book about how I was in my neighborhood getting a coffee. I was given a free eclair, and I immediately thought, oh my God, it must be because I let someone merge in front of me on the way here. Like we as a human species, this is fascinating to me, and I'm not the first to point this out, but we are the only species that fictionalizes our lives in order to make sense of them. Like we create made up stories in order to infuse some kind of cosmic logic into events because the world is confounding. Our human experience is very confusing and we want to make sense of it. And we use these really irrational strategies in order to do that, which is so ironic and not necessarily bad. Like we are profoundly mystical beings. We are not computers. We are not perfectly rational. We are making the best of our limited time and memory storage and cognitive resources. And for most of human history, the psychological shortcuts that we take were good enough. But as our society is becoming more complex and disembodied, and as our daily challenges are becoming less physical and more cerebral, those cognitive biases are kind of disservicing us.
Is modern irrationality very different than ancient irrationality? Because human history is full of mysticism and irrationality and, wild conceptual attempts to make sense of the world.
Absolutely. It's only different because the conditions of our culture are different. So the reason why these psychological shortcuts developed, and they are irrational, but they're good enough. The reason they developed is because they helped us navigate the physical world. Problems like, oh, I hear a rustling in the bushes. My attention is gravitating me toward that stimulus. My attention is a good enough indicator that that stimulus is something I need to react to. I need to run away because that thing could be a threat to me. But now rustling in the bushes, so to speak, is potentially a mean comment on our Instagram or a curt email from our boss. These stimuli are less objectively threatening. And yet we don't realize that in our bodies. We're reacting to these more cerebral or disembodied stimuli with those same fights, flights, and freezes unconsciously. And that's just one example of the type of magical overthinking or modern irrationality that I talk about in the book. But we have the sort of same Stone Age irrationalities that we've always had, but the problems we're encountering and the stimuli that we're encountering are different. And that clash has proven pretty explosive. It's why so many of us feel so bad all the time.
Well, it's interesting because it seems like when we look back at history, there's this upward trajectory of like, there's the Age of Enlightenment and there's reason, and then science comes and it's not, demons that are possessing us. So one would think eventually we get to the point where we're very rational, like we're like little Spocks. But it seems like recently in the past, hello, internet, there's been a kind of stumble back into very, very irrational thinking.
There is right now, I think, a special combination of factors that is causing us to think more magically, to behave more irrationally. And I think those combination of factors are information overload. We just can't process the volume of pieces of news and identities that we're forced to contend with every single day. So there's the information overload. There's the loneliness and disconnectedness that so many of us are experiencing, not only because of the pandemic, but because of our individualized society. And then, of course, there's the capitalistic, perfectionistic pressure to know everything under the sun. There is this pressure that you're referring to that, like, we're living in the information age. Ostensibly, you can find out any answer to any question in a matter of seconds by Googling it. But we are not wired to be able to identify facts perfectly. So even though the information might be out there, we're not necessarily going to clock it very well due to confirmation bias, zero-sum bias, overconfidence bias, all of these ideas that I write about in the book. So that combination of isolation, overload, pressure has caused a great deal of pain. And for me, I think until I started writing this book, I felt really mistrustful of like my fellow human because there were so many behaviors that I was witnessing that I couldn't make sense of. The only explanation I could land on was like, that person's like evil, like why is that person behaving that way? But to write off swaths of people as evil is like certainly not helpful for a society. And so being able to have this lens of cognitive biases has not only helped inform my decisions and brought me back down to earth and made me a little bit more skeptical of myself, it's helped me become more compassionate toward others, which is so important.
That is important. And it brings up something that I've experienced, which is online, you can be really dismissive of people, or one can be dismissive or think like, God, these people are idiots, or these people are this or that, or they're lunatics. But when you're in person in front of someone, you find a way to just their presence usually kind of humanizes them, unless they're just coming at you and attacking. You're like, oh, well, this is just a person. And we kind of believe probably like 70% of the same stuff anyway. But online, there's something about that distance, that remoteness, where we're just vicious or very unforgiving, I should say.
So true. And I write about that a little bit in the context of this cognitive bias called the halo effect in the first chapter of the book, which is about the intense cycles of celebrity worship and dethronement that we're seeing so often in society right now. Because I find that the brutality that you're describing manifests in a very unique way in some of these stan communities, these super fan communities, where they will, uplift a pop star, let's say, onto a pedestal so high that they can no longer perceive that person's humanity or make room for their complexity. Their margin of error is so slim. And we build pedestals for role models like that based on inclinations that developed long ago to help us find role models for survival purposes in our physical communities. We would, clock someone in our village who had big muscles, and we would jump to a conclusion that they were probably a good hunter and we should align ourselves with them for survival. Well, now we're displacing those tendencies onto modern parasocial relationships where we are, building up these larger than life, almost godlike expectations for our favorite pop stars who are fulfilling not just an entertainer role in society right now, but a spiritual authority role, a political authority role. Those lines have become really blurred. And then when those people do something that disappoints us by, say, expressing a political view that doesn't align with ours, or making tickets to their concerts too hard to procure, we feel the need to punish them. And we would never do that in that style in person, thanks to like that social glue that you're talking about that is missing in these online communities. And I actually talk about some of my own experiences with this in the context of my relationship with my own mother, because when I was looking into stan idol dynamics. I was reminded very much of my own relationship with my own mother when I was an adolescent. And I figured out for the first time that this woman was a human being. She was not a godlike figure. She was not perfect. She was fallible. And that was very disturbing to me, as I think it is to a lot of kids when they find out for the first time that their parents are just human, because that makes the world feel really chaotic, and it makes you feel really disappointed. And so I had some conflict with my mom growing up where I held her to this impossible standard and then punished her in a way that is not that dissimilar from the ways that I see super fans uphold their favorite celebrities to an impossible standard and then dethrone them or knock them violently off that pedestal when they don't fulfill those expectations. The difference is that I had a one-on-one real-life relationship with my mom, as hopefully many of us do with our mothers. And so I was able to use, slow thinking and empathy to mend that relationship. But that is a dynamic that can never really be solved in a parasocial context.
You cover 11 biases in the book. One of my favorites, and I want to get right to it because it's so fascinating, is manifestation. I will say maybe a couple weeks ago, I clicked on a few videos on Instagram about it, and now half of my feed is people gazing at me and telling me I can make my dreams come true by visualizing them. So what is happening? Why do people believe it? It seems absolute nonsense.
So I argue in the book that manifestation is its own kind of conspiracy theory. And I also make the argument that we all have a pinch of conspiracy theorist in us. And that is because of this fascinating cognitive bias called proportionality bias, which describes our proclivity to think that big events or even big feelings must have had a big cause. It just makes proportional sense to us. So in a conspiracy theory context, that might be Princess Diana dies. That is such an epic calamity. That couldn't have just been the product of a bunch of random tragedies. It had to have been that the royal family killed her. That's the only way this makes proportional sense to us. There we are, like, crafting stories in order to infuse logic into the world. But proportionality bias is also underlying ideas of manifestation, which are kind of like a positive spin on a conspiracy theory. It's the idea that I used to be unemployed and have no boyfriend, and now I'm getting married and have the job of my dreams because I manifested it. There is a grain of truth behind ideas of manifestation because our mindset can absolutely affect outcomes. Like, that's the whole idea behind mindfulness. But in the modern age, there are more than a few manifestation gurus, so to speak, who are willing to take advantage of our innate inclinations toward proportionality bias, seize them by the gonads, so to speak, and capitalize on those things by saying, like, oh, you're miserable, you're sick, things are happening beyond your control, sign up for my course, buy my book, and I will bestow upon you my proprietary manifestation technique, which is not pure metaphysics. It involves nervous system regulation. They'll bring in therapy speak and sort of combine all of the trending vernaculars of now to create the impression that, like, they are your manifestation guru. And if you succeed thanks to their techniques, congratulations, you have manifested. And if you don't, well, that's your fault. It's not the product of systemic injustices or random bad luck. That is your fault and your fault alone, because everything on this earth is a product of manifestation, including illness. So it's a pretty dangerous line of thinking to fall into, especially because a lot of these manifestation gurus online, not all of them, but a great deal of them, can serve as a gateway to much more dangerous conspiratorial thinking along the lines of QAnon. So I found it so fascinating that proportionality bias could explain this wide range of misattributions of cause and effect.
So how did you pick your 11 biases? Because there are so many biases. And you even talk about one called the rhyme as reason effect, which I wouldn't think would normally sort of be in the top 10 or 11, but maybe because you're a linguist, you kind of snuck that one in. And that's the perception that rhyming statements are perceived as more truthful. You want to talk a little bit about that? Because that's the first time I'd heard that one.
Yeah. So I touch on the rhyme as reason effect in a larger chapter about the illusory truth effect, which is our tendency to mistake fluency with a certain phrase or sentiment as accuracy. So the more that we hear something repeated, the more we think it's true, which is such a simple idea, but it's responsible for the mass dissemination of false news, fake news, as well as conventional wisdom that is simply false, like the idea that it takes 7 years to digest gum. I heard that so much growing up that I truly believed it until I was well into my adulthood. But yeah, how wild is that? And so, yeah, there are so many little tricks that our minds play on themselves in order to like categorize information as true and false. And again, a lot of these shortcuts are like good enough. You know, if you hear a phrase multiple times over the course of your life or even over the course of several months, it's reasonable to deduce that you're hearing it multiple times because it's true, because someone along the way has verified it by, you know, doing a physical experiment or fact checking or something. But this is being taken advantage of by a lot of really insidious public figures and politicians, this idea of repetition being mistaken as fluency. And yeah, indeed, like we tend to perceive beautiful phrases as more believable as well. And rhyme is like such a satisfying rhetorical device for us. So it's why like, you know, legends and stories are passed down with rhyme because they're easier to remember. And if they're easier to remember, then we perceive them as truer. So, you know, like in college, I heard beer before liquor, never been sicker, liquor before beer, you're in the clear. I heard that so many times that I really perceived it as true. And I don't know who started that conspiracy theory, but just because something rhymes or is beautiful or is catchy or digests like a nursery rhyme doesn't necessarily mean that it's accurate, but our minds would tell us otherwise. So this is another example of like a sort of conclusion that we jumped to because it once proved perfectly fine, now proving really sinister and dangerous because of the way that information is spread in the 21st century.
I remember that beer before liquor thing. And literally just the other day, I was like, wait, is it beer before liquor? Is it? Yeah, as if it were, you know, oh, everybody knows that. That's true. That has to be true.
Yeah. And it's interesting because like information is becoming more democratized, more accessible, which is a great thing. But it's a double-edged sword because the more information that we're forced to contend with, the more that we're leaning on these imperfect tricks to deduce like what's accurate, what's worthy of panic, etc. So, you know, the stakes get a lot higher than just like, oh, what's going to give me a worse hangover? Nowadays, the stakes are like, election results, you know, like relationships with our family members that are being ruined by Facebook headlines. It's that intense. And so, yeah, I mean, I chose the illusory truth effect for that chapter in part because like I just love writing about language and I find it absolutely fascinating and like just a sparkly joy for my brain, but also because like we are in an election year and it's so important to remember that like in the information age, our attention spans are shrinking. Studies find this to be true. And so we can't always trust our attention, our instincts, our cognitive biases as the most reliable barometer for knowing what's true.
Yeah, it is kind of a double-edged sword, or that's probably the wrong metaphor. But
it's exactly that.
Okay, a shrinking attention span, more and more information coming at us. So the things that stick are the things that are memorable, but the things that are memorable are not necessarily true. In fact, they're very often untrue. That's why they're memorable. Yeah.
Exactly. And, you know, like there are plenty of science communicators and educators who are taking advantage of the illusory truth effect in a beautiful way. Like I referenced some quotes from Carl Sagan in that chapter, who was such a master of blending storytelling techniques with factual information and making learning about science really fun. But at the same time, purveyors of misinformation and disinformation can take advantage of these techniques as well. So like anything, all of these biases, just like technological advancement itself, is, like you said, a double-edged sword. It comes with pros and cons.
So your previous two books dealt with language more explicitly because you're a linguist. We had Cultish, which was about the language of fanaticism. And before that, there was Word Slut, which is a feminist guide to the English language, or taking back the English language. You switched to writing about cognitive biases. Did you feel intimidated at all switching fields?
Fortunately, I am not positioning myself as an expert in cognitive biases by any means, but cognitive biases, when you read about them, even in academic texts, are actually like really easy to understand. It's behavioral economics. It's not math. Like it is actually a field that we can all understand pretty easily, but it's normally kept on the high shelf of academia or written in a context that doesn't feel super relatable. But cognitive biases are super relevant to our daily choices. It's just not always written about in that context. So I did a whole bunch of foundational reading about these different cognitive biases. And I didn't answer your question before, but I chose them based on vibes. Like there are hundreds of cognitive biases that have been described, but truthfully, like I was reading through them and there were a certain selection of them that really jumped out at me as explaining so much of the irrational behavior that I was noticing in the culture and in my own life. So I really trusted those impulses. Like when I read about the IKEA effect, for example, which describes our tendency to overvalue products and creations that we helped create. I was like, oh my God, that explains so much of what we're seeing right now, from our anxieties about AI to the explosive success of the meal kit market. And I was like, I have to follow my instincts in terms of like writing about the IKEA effect. So when I was choosing these biases, like I really went on vibes. And then I did a whole bunch of foundational reading, both about, the earliest writings about each of these biases, but also the research about them is ongoing and it's being applied to more modern contexts. And so I was sure to read a whole bunch about that. And then from that point, I kind of used these biases as like a literary motif, if you will, because the book is about this like very broad concept of magical overthinking, irrationality in the modern age, but being able to constrain the ideas by cognitive biases really helped contain my writing process, made it feel more streamlined and more clear as well. So I was definitely intimidated to traffic in waters that like aren't my comfort zone or aren't my wheelhouse. But I was also excited to embark on a more reporterly project, like a slightly more literary project, and to be able to write about my personal experiences more.
I was pleased to see how surprisingly personal the book was, because there are moments where you share quite a bit about your life. You talk about a formative romantic relationship in your 20s. Is that something that happened originally, or as a former book editor, I have to know, was that a request from your editor? Or was your editor like, I need a more Amanda in this? Too many interviews, not enough Amanda.
Yeah, when I was in college and I first was committing to the notion that I really wanted to write books, which is obviously like a curse when you're like, oh God, I really, really want to do this. I originally wanted to write more personal things. I loved essay writing. I loved David Sedaris when I was in high school. I loved Sloane Crosley. Like I loved Nora Ephron. I loved humor essayists. But that didn't end up being the genre that I would write in for so many reasons. That was like not going to be my journey. But I had always wanted to write in this more in a more personal capacity. But then I got used to writing about topics that really fascinated me that were more outside of my own life. And that felt safer too, because I didn't have to put my head on the chopping block for the reader. I could just sort of write about these disconnected topics from a more, colloquial standpoint, of course, but like I never really had to put my vulnerability at stake. And then when it came time to write a more personal text, I did find myself feeling nervous, and I was like relying more on social science and the more reporterly stuff. And in edits, my editor was like, we need more of you. We need more of the people in your life. Like, throw yourself under the bus a little bit. And so that was like a really great challenge just for my own writing practice. And I in the end, and this is like IKEA effect style, another effort justification bias, I'm like, this book means so much more to me because I lay so much out on the line.
Well, I found it very moving. And I've known you a little over the years through your books, but this one gave me much more of a sense of kind of where you came from in your life. And you talk about writing about sort of health and beauty, which surprised me. I didn't know you ever had that. It actually felt like, I'm going to embarrass myself now, but my 14-year-old daughter is obsessed with rom-coms, but most of them are from like 80s and 90s, right? They kind of went away for a while. So we watch all these rom-coms and the protagonist is inevitably like a pretty young woman in New York City who works at a magazine but wants to write like real stuff, right? Wants to write about politics or whatever, even though it's not very believable. And then I was like, oh my God,
yes.
Amanda, you could, yeah.
I am a rom-com trope for sure. Yeah. So I moved to LA for this terrible ex-boyfriend, even though I wanted to stay in New York and be a more literary writer. But then I found myself in Los Angeles, and the only, this is a scoop, Fanio, the only website that would employ me when I first moved here was a website called bikini.com. That was my first job. I kind of like omitted that part from this chapter just for like...
You sure did.
You know, to keep this...
I don't remember seeing the word bikini does not even appear in the manuscript anywhere, let alone bikini.com.
Absolutely not.
By the way, I just looked up bikini.com. The site is under construction. It's coming soon. And there's a woman who is not wearing a bikini on the front. So I'm a little confused, but okay.
Oh, I'm so glad to hear that website doesn't exist anymore.
It's gone.
But yeah, so I didn't name check bikini.com in the book, but that was my first writing job. And I mean, we were still reeling from the 2008 recession. Like there simply were not writing jobs, much less writing jobs with any dignity in Los Angeles. So I just took what I could get. And yeah, I spent the first 5 years of my writing career penning cosmetics reviews. I mean, I graduated from bikini.com to like a less janky website and then an even less janky website. Still all pretty janky websites. But I write about that experience in the book in the context of zero-sum bias, which is our penchant to believe that another person's gain directly means your loss. And it's a bias that stems from, centuries of stiff resource competition. But we are now mapping our zero-sum bias onto currencies like clout and followers and beauty, not just resources like food and mates. And that is causing, particularly women, a great deal of psychological turmoil. So when I was working in the beauty industry, I was comparing myself to these like beautiful blonde bloggers, and that really dinged my self-esteem. And when I was finally able to quit the beauty industry and write about subjects that were a little more meaningful to me than eye cream, I thought like, oh, I've been released from comparison purgatory. This is going to be so much better. Joke's on me, because the algorithm quickly figured me out. My Instagram algorithm was no longer showing me like, beautiful, like long hair extended influencers on rooftops. Now it was showing me like Gia Tolentino. And I was like, God damn it. Because comparing myself to her was so much worse. But it's just so funny how like this cognitive bias that was once meant to protect us now causes us to make enemies out of people who we really should befriend, because their success and coolness does not actually threaten our success and coolness, but that is what our minds trick us to believe. So anyway, name checking Gia, I'm obsessed with her, but I did compare myself to her when my algorithm changed.
Well, that's one of the scary things about algorithms, right? Is they exploit our vulnerabilities and our insecurities too. I mean, sure, we could react differently, right? You talked about that in the book. We could learn to befriend people that we admire instead of envy them, right? And feel intimidated by them. But it's hard to do consistently. And especially when the AI is like, oh, you're not doing this. What about this? Oh, you're interested in getting in shape? Look at this guy. Look at her. And you're like, oh God, I'm really not in shape. So
exactly,
because that's what gets your attention, and they exploit it.
Yes.
And it's a tough, systemic, like the system is pretty brutal. You look at those movies, like, sorry to go to movies, but, Terminator 2, and you see these big robots and they're smashing everything. You're like, oh my God, how do you fight a robot? Well, just, transpose that into like a mental battle. It's like, yeah, we have our little fleshy brains with all our silly vulnerabilities. And then you've got this algorithm that's moving at the speed of light, figuring you out because we're so predictable, and then just exploiting that. And we're like, oh my God, click, 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 click.
That is like a summary of the book. Exactly. I mean, the information age, and in some cases, ill-intentioned tech CEOs, are causing a mental catastrophe that we are perpetuating all by ourselves, sedentary on our couches. It doesn't look like the robot apocalypse that movies have shown us.
Yeah, it's much less physical. I will agree. It's just,
I know.
Like, oh, this is,
oh my God.
It's like the T.S. Eliot, right? This is how the world ends, not with a bang but a whimper.
Not with a bang but a whimper. Yeah. Yes.
I think a whimper.
That is, yes.
Right?
He fucking knew. He knew. And this Yes, and this highlights like some of the solutions too, because this is like not a self-help book by any means, but I did come across a lot of studies that did provide some really actionable and serviceable advice that I have been implementing in my life. And like, to boil it down, we are not built for the disembodied, cerebral, technologically bound world that we've created. We're built for the physical world. We're built for these in-person connections. And so whenever possible, to like get outside of our self-focused hellscape of our own minds, to like step aside of ourselves, to immerse ourselves in nature, to immerse ourselves in a feeling of awe, to do something with our hands. Like it's so simple and it sounds like so corny, but I find that we've overcomplicated our culture, and we've also overcomplicated the solutions to our most profound miseries by saying like, oh no, you need to sign up for this course, or you need to follow this manifestation guru on TikTok or whatever. And it's like, the reason why the phrase touch grass has exploded in popular discourse is because there is some truth to that. We need to connect with the physical world we were made for.
Absolutely. There's that, the food heuristic where people say, only eat things that your grandmother would recognize as food. And if it's, some weird thing in 7-Eleven, that's not food. That's like a Hot Pocket. I feel like the same thing about just behavior in life. Like, would your grandmother do this? Would your grandmother scroll on Instagram for an hour and a half before going to bed? Probably not. She'd get a good night's sleep because she's got a farm to run the next day. So like that, walk outside.
And look, for sure. And I would not trade places with my grandmother, by the way. Like there's some really interesting research about nostalgia, some of which I quoted in the book. And I was able to explore it even more. I have an op-ed coming out in the LA Times soon that talks about creating nostalgia for the present, because when the present feels painful, we often glamorize the past. And that's a coping mechanism and it's healthy. But again, there are some pretty nefarious political leaders who are more than willing to weaponize that, who will like make up some delusion about the past in order to sell us their vision for the future. I was talking to a nostalgia scholar recently named Clay Rutledge for this LA Times piece who studies nostalgia. And he was referencing, I think it was a Harris poll that reflected that Americans across all generations feel nostalgic for a time before iPhones. And when asked if they thought life in America was better in the 50s, they will say yes. But then when you get more surgical about the questions, like, okay, if you have a daughter, like, would you really rather go back to a time in the 50s before she would be allowed to have a credit card or like have all these rights? They're like, oh, okay, no, I'm going to walk back that answer. Or would you really go back to the time in the 1950s before modern cancer treatments or like other medical treatments that we have access to now? And they're like, oh, okay, no, you're probably right. So I try my best to have like an accurate vision of the past when I so badly want to glamorize literally the hunter-gatherer period. I'm like, oh my God, I just want to be like a villager picking berries, no capitalism, And it's like, no, everyone died by being attacked by a bear. Like, you do not want to live during that time. But I think we can kind of take what we know about the past and combine it with all of the many benefits of the present to, oh my God, excuse this like really corny, pithy statement I'm about to make, but like to create a better future. Like,
I feel like
it's like
you're running for office now, but yes, I'm on board. I'm voting. Can I be on your
I don't need to.
election campaign?
The LinkedIn Podcast Network is sponsored by TIAA. In the last 100 years, we've seen financial markets swing, new currencies come and go, decades of savings lost in days, all showing that a retirement plan without a guarantee, quite simply, isn't enough. So more than a retirement plan, TIAA makes you a retirement promise. A promise of a guaranteed retirement paycheck for life. A promise that pays off. Learn more at TIAA.org/promisespayoff.
As the Next Big Idea Club's editorial director, I spend much of my time collaborating with our friends Adam Grant, Malcolm Gladwell, Susan Cain, and Daniel Pink on our Next Big Idea Club box subscription. Every quarter, they pick the 2 best new works of nonfiction, and then we send them to our subscribers. If you sign up, you'll also get access to our beautiful audio and video e-courses, VIP invites to our live events, and membership in our LinkedIn community. Plus, you'll be helping us continue to make this show. So if this is at all interesting to you, go to nextbigideaclub.com. Learn more. And if you do end up subscribing, use the promo code podcast at checkout to get 20% off. That's nextbigideaclub.com, promo code podcast. Let's talk about astrology. So, it is surprisingly, it seems like astrology really has stuck around. I mean, I don't know when it came out, but lots of people believe in it. And to me, what's surprising, and I'm going to sound like an asshole here, but like, it seems so blatantly wrong. I have twins, right? For me, I'm like, okay, well, there's your, like, they are so different from each other. No, like they're like the same house, rising sun, everything. Like clearly there's nothing to it, regardless of the fact that like I don't even understand how the mechanism would work.
Yeah. And
yet lots of intelligent people believe in astrology. Maybe I'm just being a jerk. Is it just like a comfort? Is it just like a pacifier and like I should let it go? What should I do?
Yeah, I know. I also so badly want to judge people's sincere engagement with astrology, even though really smart, otherwise rational,
right,
like critically thinking human beings are obsessed with their chart. And, you know, I think part of what's going on is simply that, well, I talk about astrology in the context of confirmation bias in the book, and I talk about it in a cheeky capacity. But I think it's just like a really beautiful framework at best to connect with other people about certain stages of life. You know, like I could roll my eyes all day long about ideas of like the Saturn return, but I think it is a common enough experience to go through stressful life transitions when you're, you know, in that late 20s to early 30s stage. And if we create a mythology surrounding that to make connecting about that particular stress more fun and like more beautiful and more cosmic, then I don't necessarily see anything nefarious about that. It's just when we take it too far and we don't take it with a grain of salt and we're like truly basing our social life based on Mercury's position in the cosmos, or truly basing our political opinions based on astrology, or, you know, whether or not to get vaccinated, et cetera. That's the sort of dogmatic absolutism that disturbs me. But I love engaging in a bit of casual mysticism. Like I love ritual. We human beings crave ritual. It helps our lives feel more meaningful and more manageable. So astrology is kind of like a new secular religion for us. I mean, it is literally that. And the fact that it has been embraced so wholeheartedly by the queer community, I think really reflects that, you know, we are still craving spirituality and community. And when there are so many religions that don't make space for particular identities, we're going to find that somewhere else. So, you know, when I'm at a party in LA where there are a lot of queer people present and we're all talking about astrology, I find that it's just connective tissue. It's social connective tissue that's really meaningful and really safe. But certainly any of the delusions that I talk about in the book can be fun on one end and like really fucked up on another.
Did you know, I recently learned about this, that there is Celtic tree astrology? There is an entire
what does that mean?
So there's a druidic astrological or zodiacal system. Just made that word up, I think. It's based on the lunar system, and everybody has a tree based on their birthday. And that tree has certain, you know, I guess, traits. For example, I am an oak, which is, I guess it's good, sturdy or whatever. I looked up your birthday out of curiosity. Your birthday is very close to my wife's birthday, so I looked you up. And you're a rowan, which is a type of Celtic tree, I guess, which means highly intelligent, influential, and patient. Very flattering.
Oh, I need to work on the latter.
It's a whole, it's a whole system of, it's a zodiac, which is, you know, based on the day you're born. And there's 12 or 13 of them. I don't remember. But that threw me. And I thought, okay, so this is a thing that all these different, you know, all these different cultures have.
Yeah, I love that tendency in human beings. Like, I think it's actually really wholesome. We just want to understand each other. We want to understand why we're here. And people who try to institutionalize those impulses and market them and weaponize them deserve to be questioned. But the behaviors and the impulses themselves, I think, are really beautiful, really human. Who doesn't love space? Who doesn't love trees? Like, I love that we're using what we see in the natural world around us to try to make sense of things that will probably never make sense. You know, and I love that we're doing that.
I have a question. This is actually technically my wife's question. She read the book as well. She loved your book. And she was supposed to interview you and then unfortunately has a conflict. So I said, do you have any questions you want me to ask Amanda since you didn't get the chance? She gave me one question.
Yeah.
She said, I don't want to take credit for it. I think it's a very good question. She said, I feel like a certain amount of magical thinking aids in creativity. Obviously, quackery is wrong and exploits people, but finding meaning and symbolism in random places seems so integral to art. Can you speak to that? And I feel like you kind of were getting to that a little just now.
There's a chapter in the book about overconfidence bias, which talks about how destructive it is that we each like overvalue our capabilities and overcredit ourselves with positive outcomes. But if it weren't for overconfidence, if it weren't for that delusion that like we could change the world or we could create a piece of art that will move millions of people, then we would never start projects. We would never finish projects. That's in the context of art or science. Like, we need Delulu for progress. Yes, we need magical thinking for creativity. I think that's why so many people's creative processes are kind of spiritual or ritualistic, because it is beneficial to tap into that sense of imagination. So yeah, 100%. Like, this book is all about cognitive dissonance and like being able to stomach that dizzying feeling of like, I want to be rational, but I want to be Delulu. Like, I want to prioritize facts and truth, but I also want to prioritize beauty, you know? And I think being able to live in that swing between like logos and pathos and these other conflicts is what will help us survive this age of magical overthinking, you know?
That's really beautifully stated. And to get back to something you were saying earlier with the importance of ritual, right? You know, I look at it as a parent a lot. I have little kids and, you know, they have birthdays and holidays and these are all like very important to them. And then at a certain point, they just kind of get phased out, right? You know, Easter Bunny doesn't come anymore or Santa doesn't get, you know, you still have these things, but it's very hard because part of becoming an adult is putting aside what is this sort of like, it's almost like a comforting, sheltering element of mystery and sort of being taken care of in a way by the universe, which extends throughout your house. And then you think, okay, well, now I'm in my 20s and just, this is it. This is life. I got to get a paycheck. I got to get a job. I got to figure out who I'm falling in love with and how that's going to work and all the pain of that. And we are missing these rituals, you know, the sort of Joseph Campbell things of like, well, you know what, when you're 25, you don't need rituals anymore. When you're 30, when you have your first kid, like, of course, like these rituals are fundamental, both to being part of a community and feeling like, oh, people who came before me have done it and people who will come after me and I'm part of something bigger and there's some sense of order and meaning to it. And so that kind of, to me, that's one of the reasons why I think people reach out so much for conspiracy theories and things like that, because it's like, no, I need a little bit of meaning. I need a little bit of structure. I need a community.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And even if that meaning is negative or paranoid, it still feels better than having none at all. And so that's why, you know, depending on your community or your aesthetic or whatever it is, you might fall down a truly fucked up QAnon conspiratorial rabbit hole, or you might go off into like a manifestation divine circle or whatever it is. But you're exactly right. Like, we crave that ritual and that order and that meaning so badly. And I think like in this profoundly disconnected time, you're right. In the United States, at least, we've lost so much of that ritual. But we can't let people with ill intentions take advantage of those cravings.
You've dived very deep into all of these biases and communities and conspiracies. Has it inspired in you the hope to create your own? I mean, it's almost like if you study like, you know, you study like Ponzi schemes, you're like, well, I could do like a nice one that doesn't hurt anyone. I mean, is there one where you're like, you know, there's kind of a version where you cobble something together that's actually beneficial as opposed to exploitative?
Yeah. Well, this is
that
like
the new business?
I know. This is so innocent, but I did a book event the other day in New York where my interlocutor, a novelist named Amanda Montell, had the amazing idea of harnessing the illusory truth effect to start a very innocuous rumor in that room at that moment and to start spreading it, but like a magical, adorable rumor. This particular book event happened to be at the Meta offices in New York City. And she had the brilliant idea of starting a rumor that I would love for all of the listeners right now to spread, that there is a secret petting zoo in the Meta offices in New York City. And so I took this like really bizarre and absolutely hilarious video of like the entire audience just saying, you've got to see the petting zoo. And everyone started like posting on Threads and Instagram about like the amazing petting zoo at Meta. And it was so funny and like such a cheeky roast of how rumors and conspiracy theories spread like that. And so now I think at every single one of my book tour events, I want to collectively start and spread an adorable mythology, aka rumor.
I love that idea. And I'm going to put that on my manifestation board to help you make that come true.
Thank you so much. That means a lot.
Thank you for joining me today. This is fun. I could talk about this all day. One last question I was curious about is, has anyone responded in a way to the book? I mean, I know the book's just coming out, so I guess you probably, you just had a few book readings and so, but has anyone responded in a way to the book that made you feel like, okay, this is why I wrote the book? I'm so glad.
Oh my God. Yes. Yes. I mean, I didn't realize when I'm writing a book, I feel like this is so formal. I'm writing a book. Like I am trying so hard and I'm going to sound so smart. And then the book comes out and everybody's like, oh, Amanda, she is so cozy. I just feel like I'm talking to my bestie.
Best friend.
And I'm just like, God damn it. I'm like, I tried so hard to sound formal and logical and like I was making sense. And then at the end of the day, like I just sound like the girl next door. But I actually love that because, I mean, there's nothing I can do to control it. Like I could try till the freaking cows come home to sound like academic. And it's not going to happen because like I am your social science bestie. But the beautiful part about that, and this is not something I thought people would take away from the book, and I'm so glad that they are. People are like, this book makes me feel so validated as to why it just feels bad to exist as a human in the world right now. Like, I feel so connected to my like fellow Delulu human thanks to this book, and I feel more forgiving of myself and I feel more forgiving of other people because like Amanda's going through this too. And so like I love that. Yeah, like I want us all, I don't know, there's so much disconnection and conflict and isolation. And I'm glad in the end that the book doesn't come across as more academic than it does, because if the sort of like intimacy in it can make people feel that way, then I think it did what it needed to do.
It's a great book and it is super smart and super readable. And it does feel like your best friend is talking to you, but your best friend did some really good research before they showed up for a drink. So that's what I appreciate. It's not, not just, oh, I heard this thing somewhere. Like you've got actual citations.
Yeah.
It was great. I think people are going to love it. I loved it. And like I told you before, my wife snatched my copy and read it before I even had a chance. So that's a good sign. If someone steals your book, that's the ultimate compliment.
Hell yeah. I'm hoping people will steal this all over their place. It's a good cover, It's a pretty cover. I want people to steal it.
And also you have the enormous poster behind you in case I don't know what the cover looks like. I'm sorry.
Oh gosh. Yeah. No, again, not my fault.
This was really fun. Thanks for joining me.
Yeah, my pleasure.
That was my colleague, Panio Giannopoulos, in conversation with Amanda Montell. Her new book, The Age of Magical Overthinking, is out now. Today's episode was produced by Caleb Bissinger, sound designed by Mike Toda. Our hyper-rational collaborators at the LinkedIn Podcast Network are miraculously without cognitive biases at all. I'm Rufus Griscom. See you next week.